Hi, everybody, and welcome to InterPride's panel about race and pride. This is a panel that we wish to demonstrate how racism affects pride, how racism hinders the impact of pride, and how racism paralyzes pride organizers. And then we would like to suggest methods and ways to frame, to address, and to bring measurable solutions to these challenges. With us, a roster of fantastic speakers. Richard Bretour-Bell is the co-chair of InterPride's Human Rights and Diversity Committee. He's Diversity and Inclusion Director for Albuquerque Pride, and he's Community Outreach Director for El Paso Sun City Pride. Zaina Ratti is the former chair at Oxford Pride. She's a therapist working with LGBTQIA+ people and on topics related to race and ethnicity. Julian, they are the co-president of InterPride, former board member of New York City Pride, and one of the designers of the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program of InterPride that we'll be talking about. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. We're very honored and privileged to have you with us. And perhaps the first question that we would like to ask is to understand how race manifests, how race expresses itself in Pride. So could you perhaps share with us some personal examples on where you personally or encounter or where you witnessed frictions or any traction because of matters and topics related to race, to color, to ethnicity?
Well, I have multiple examples, but one that comes to mind is I was volunteering at a Pride in Florida, and I was in the car with a friend of mine, and he received a phone call from a volunteer. He put on speaker. The volunteer referred to a Black manager of one of the entertainers as a nigger and as a ghetto thug. And my friend said, "Oh, you shouldn't say that because Richard's here." He didn't tell him you shouldn't say it because it's offensive and it's disgusting. He said Richard might be offended by this. So I spoke to the president of the organization, and he told me, this is a Pride organization. He told me that while he didn't agree with what the volunteer said, he supports his right to say it. Here in the United States, we have a diluted version or idea of what free speech entails, meaning that you won't be prosecuted for it, but that certainly doesn't mean you won't face consequences for it. A business, an entity, a government has the right to say, you don't represent us because we don't like the words that come out of your mouth. He didn't do that. And for me, it was hurt by the guy, the volunteer, hurt by my friend not taking action, and then going to the president and saying, hey, this is what's going on. This is what some of your volunteers are saying. Oh, well, he has a right to say it. It's disgusting.
I think it's probably people have been allowed to talk in such a way about people. You know, I was the first person of color to be chair of Oxford Pride, and I'm a DEA trainer anyway. And so it was apparent that there were issues within Pride. But when you have people coming into meetings, and this happened, I think it was about a year before I became chair, and somebody came into a meeting and said, why have you whitewashed the stage? And there was no answer to that. It was literally, oh, well, we've just done the stage. Now, the problem with that is when I began to introduce, so I was chair for 2 years, one theme was diversity and the other was inclusion matters. And I know, and I wrote a piece on Medium called the Structurally Embedded Advantage of Safety about my experience as a POC chair. I know that people were going and basically doing toxic gossiping and saying that inclusion diversity was pompous politics. And I'm constantly having to go, this is not a fad. This is something we should be doing. We should be challenging. We should be looking at the whitewash stages. We should be looking about unsafe spaces for Black and POCs at Prides. We should be looking at the unchallenged views. Obviously we have the 9 protected identity characteristics in the Equality Act in the UK. but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are upheld or challenged. We have this hierarchy of marginalization within our community, where some people are at the top, some people have visibility, they have the power, they have the money, and there is a whole group of people who are marginalized within our marginalized community.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Zane. I actually read the article that you wrote. Thank you for being so brave to come out and talk about your experience. I definitely appreciated that. You know, for me personally, I'd like to, I mean, as a person of color and also as a non-binary individual and as an immigrant in the United States, I've had just, you know, there's so many different layers and that I obviously identify with, and, you know, I've experienced a lot of different discrimination because of that. But, you know, two experiences that do come to mind, one of which, you know, in New York City Pride, we have an election process for board members. And I remember distinctively during one of the years when I was running for a position on the board, there are folks who actually, you know, quite candidly told me that we'd rather vote a white person in, because you being a person of color, you're not going to be able to get stuff done. You're not going to get the support unlike a white person. And that was the exact words that were used, that sentence. And I, you know, of course, I've faced all sorts of other discrimination because of my immigration status, etc. Also, you know, interestingly, it's not something that's, you know, contrary to popular belief. You know, people seem to think that this is just something that happens in the United States because of our history with racism. You know, no, this actually happens all over the world. You know, a good example is my experience in one of those countries in Europe when I was actually traveling there for InterPride. I had the privilege of attending a public forum where there were 3 different individuals from Africa who had just recently gotten their asylum, and they were talking about their experiences as people of color, as transgender individuals, and as part of the LGBTQIA+ community. And there were folks who were, you know, obviously they're not immigrants, etc. And, you know, during the session stood up, and that cannot be your experience, because that's not my experience. You know, having lived in this country, I literally stood up and say, I would really, you know, could you please be respectful to the panelists? This is their experience. This is not your experience. Let's listen to what they have to say. And I actually, you know, lodged an official complaint with the organizers, and I said this shouldn't have happened. You know, you should have created a safer space. The speakers actually felt very threatened in this space. They didn't feel safe, and that's not how we should be organizing. As Pride organizers, we should be very mindful of this sort of situation. So these are just some examples. There's just a lot of different examples. I've not been in the Pride, you know, organizing Pride for very long. It's about 8 years or so, but I've experienced a lot throughout the world, actually, with, you know, traveling to so many different parts of the world, just experiencing racism. So it's actually very prevalent and not just a US thing. And I had to say that.
Certainly. Certainly. And this is also part of the conversation that InterPride has been having internally and also among other members, when it was important to explain that while there have been many conversations the past year because of the murder of George Floyd and with the magnitude of Black Lives Matter that it took in the press and so on, this is not a US-centric problem. You do not only find racism and this opposition or this series of bias, microaggressions and other expressions in the US. It's all over the world in every single one of our countries and cities. And this is very important to keep on repeating it. And this is also one of the reasons why we're doing this now in this Human Rights Program of Copenhagen 2021. So I mentioned bias, I mentioned microaggressions, and these are terms that are not understood by everybody. And actually, to be full transparent, very few people do understand what it means. When we mention matters related to bias, to microaggression, to prejudice, etc. Now, for example, Julian, I believe, and do correct me if I'm wrong, when you said that somebody told you that you cannot get things done because of your color, this is a bias that we carry with us when we believe that some races or some colors cannot simply get things done, either because they don't have the necessary capacity or because they will not, others will not engage with them, with the same capacity and with the same, as needed. So how would you, Richard, define bias, microaggressions, and these terms?
I was on mute. I have a workshop that I'm giving at the Human Rights Conference entitled Implicit Bias. For me, I've moved away from race so much, or racism. I mean, not that it doesn't exist, but I think for so many people, the moment they hear that word, they shut down. I mean, it's as if you cannot communicate with them at all. Sometimes they cry, sometimes they talk about all the people of color in their lives, former lovers, and they're still missing the point. Isabel Wilkerson wrote this book entitled Caste, and she talks about it from the perspective of the American caste system. And she talks about India's caste system, what happened in Nazi Germany, what happened in Africa, and you realize that race is a social construct. It is just a way of placing people on a certain social hierarchy and what they would consider that, or what the dominant class would consider their respective places on that social hierarchy. Because of that, it impacts every aspect of our society. We can't say we're not a racist country, regardless of what country you come from. We can't say there's no racism at work. We can't say any of these things because it's not so much about race as it is about placement in society. A caste is what she's referring to. What I see in the United States is that if they're not carrying a torch, if they're not carrying a rebel flag, if they're not the Klan, if they're not neo-Nazis, so many people have in their mind that this is not racist, this is not bias, and it's just untrue. We all have biases, but biases are, we're exposed to it through the media, through television, through magazines, through every aspect of the media and communication. So it exists, it's real. Microaggressions would be those little slights, those indignities that people of color suffer. I have an example. When I was working in HR in the hospital, we were holding a meeting to talk about diversity and bias and microaggressions. And one of my coworkers asked me for an example of microaggressions. And I said, well, I have dreadlocks. And the assumption often is that I don't wash my hair, which is just not true, of course. I actually have never met a person that I knew of that didn't wash their hair. So I would have no reason to conclude or think or assume that anyone wouldn't wash their hair. As I'm explaining this to her, the CEO of the hospital walks in and says, hey, well, I lived in Florida, and the CEO being of the dominant class, I lived in Florida and I knew plenty of Haitians who didn't wash their hair. Now, we all know that's just not true. Even if you knew 4, 5, 6 Haitians, what you're doing is stereotyping, and what you're doing is using a microaggression against me while I'm in the process of explaining what a microaggression is. That's how prevalent it is in our society.
Zaina.
When you started talking about your hair there, Richard, I'm like, I used to chemically straighten my hair. I've grown up in Oxfordshire. I'm mixed heritage, Nigerian, English. And I had no idea what to do with my hair. So I ended up chemically straightening it until it all fell out. And then I'm like, actually, this is just my hair. And so I now keep it. you know, when we're thinking about biases, and it's something obviously I go through as a psychotherapist a lot with clients, you know, our community has a tremendous amount of what we call affinity bias. So it basically means likes. So if you see people who are, for instance, on committees that look like you, then you feel comfortable going on that committee. However, if you don't have visibility and representation, you don't feel comfortable going on those types of committees. You know, when we're thinking about those kind of implicit and explicit biases, so explicit biases are direct, implicit are indirect, which is kind of what a microaggression is. A microaggression, I always describe it as like a 1,000 paper cuts. You know, you might not notice one, but when you get 10, it's going to sting. And what people then do is they will withdraw from engaging. So I left my post and did not restand as chair because of what I had been through. And when we are losing people from the cause like that, we really need to take a step back and go, why are we not allowing our beliefs to be challenged? One way that psychotherapists explain it is a thing called a Moore's paradox. It's our ability to believe something that is untrue, such as Black people with dreadlocks don't wash their hair. Find one person who believes that, they will join a group, and the whole group believes it. You know, so when we can recognize that there are actually things in our brain that we can begin to change how we look at what biases are, where they came from, because quite often those biases aren't ones we have come to the conclusion as an adult with. They are usually absorbed by osmosis, by familial outlook from faith, religion, belief, location. We obviously have to kind of think about the fact that race and ethnicity are two different things. Race is more genetic, ethnicity is culture-based and location-based. We also can begin to think about intersectionality as opposed to talking about racism, because you're quite right, Richard, as soon as you mention the R word or the P word, privilege is another word that I now don't use in my trainings. I use phrases such as structurally embedded advantage to explain that privilege that people might have that they might not necessarily know they have until somebody needs to come along and point it out. So it isn't just kind of biases and microaggressions, it's the intersectionality that we all have. I have, you know, I am heteronormatively married. I'm a bisexual female. I'm a parent. I'm a grandparent. All of these things add up to my intersections. And when other people realize that they've got intersections too, we can all realize that sometimes we have a structurally embedded advantage and sometimes we have a structurally embedded disadvantage.
How articulate. It's so beautiful, actually. It's so beautiful to hear you say this, because it's very accessible. And guess what? Julian is also extremely accessible when they explain matters related to you know, things that we misunderstand. And we often have very insightful conversations on these matters. And I personally learned a lot from Julian. And, you know, building on what Richard said, that he's shifting the discourse and the terms he uses to keep the channel of communication open with the people. And then you, Zaina, you also mention the same. So you are using structure, not structures, but methods or procedures or techniques to, you know, make this conversation that is uncomfortable, sometimes, often, make it more accessible to people, at least to people of goodwill who still want to engage and to hear. So, Julian, how do you do this? Tell us more about this, this faculty and this willingness to keep the channels of communication open. So we learn from this, and we have many people doing somehow the same accessibility and education that the three of you are leading here.
I think first and foremost, people need to want to change, and that's where it's easier to start. And I think a lot of people, at least in the circles that I've been, sometimes they don't understand bias to start up with, implicit bias, and so they navigate their lives thinking that, oh, just because they don't say a certain word or they don't treat individuals a certain way, they cannot be racist, they cannot have biases. It's just going back to what Richard stated earlier, how people shut down when you bring out the word racism, but they don't understand all of these different concepts. And I think first and foremost, people need to want to change and understand this. I think that's where it's easy to start, because I've spoken with a number of pride leaders in different countries. And the minute you use the word race or racism in the sentence, they shut down immediately. And just like Richard said, I cannot be racist because I've got 9 friends or people of color, and I've talked to them about all of these issues. So there's no way I'm racist, or my partner is, or my stepbrother is a person of color, whatever. It's funny how people think just because you have association that way you don't have biases. I think that's where people need to understand, read up a little bit more about biases, what microaggression is, what is colorism, and why, in certain parts of the world, police brutality is still a common problem that people of color face, and why there's a lot of fear among people of color, especially pride organizers. We need to be more sensitive when we bring up these issues, when we talk about these issues, why we're talking about it, why are we wanting to have a discussion about police presence, how the history of police relationships with people of color, the dynamics that we've gone through over many years in different parts of the world. So I think these are important conversations to have. And I think when people are willing to want to talk about this or listen to this, it's a little easier to have these conversations. I find myself having a lot of interesting conversations, even with people on our board. I know Heidi and I, like Heidi pointed out, we've had a lot of conversations around, issues related to racism and how it manifests in different individuals. What's also interesting is I think people should actually check this implicit association test, or I think it's called IAT. It's actually a very interesting way to find out your own implicit biases. It was a project that was started in the 1990s. It's called Project Implicit. It's available online. People can actually go and check it out. It associates, it's an association of terms and pictures. So, intentionally, they'll give you a picture of, say, a person of color, and then they might give you a negative word and a positive word, and it's associating things very quickly. And so they're able to determine your bias. Again, this is just, it's nothing is 100% accurate, but it gives you an idea of, where your biases lies. And I really recommend people trying it out. It gives you an understanding. I will admit for a fact that I have my own biases. Every one of us does. So this gave me awareness of other biases that I have, and I probably need to be more sensitive of. And I've actively and consciously taken a step back and watch myself in every actions, whether it's word or whether it's what I'm thinking. And that's one way I've been unlearning my own biases. And that's something that I really recommend. First learn, second, read, talk to other people about it. 3, look at other resources like this that's available, whether they're webinars, whether they're tests like this. And then have conversations, have brave conversations and want to change. And I think when you do all of this, it's a little easier as pride organizers as well to figure out what we can do internally. Whether it's making sure that there's more representation on our boards, whether it's making sure that events are safer for people of color, whether we need to have a serious discussion about including police in our events. There's just so many different things. What is tokenism, and why is it important to intentionally be inclusive, but also not tokenize somebody? These are important conversations for us all to have as pride organizers. I hope that's a little, this information is helpful, Heidi.
Listen, it's an information that is crucial. It touches on another aspect of this webinar, which is providing, discussing resources and also how Pride organizers, how we can all do better when it comes to topics related to race, to ethnicity, to color, to let's say to the otherness around us. InterPride, last November 2020, created the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program. And the goal of this program is to provide resources so Pride organizers can identify issues related to race, for example, to oppression, and to address them, to eventually prevent them. Julian, you're one of the designers of this program, but before we get to you, I am eager to hear from Zaina and Richard about how Pride organizers can concretely, in a measurable way, create structures where people decide to be participants in the design and the action and the impact of Pride, rather than being at the receiving end where they attend Pride and then, just make commentary. How can we foster this structure, this environment, so people participate, be part of it, and change happens collectively?
I guess I always say you can't be what you can't see. And that was one of the reasons why I stood up as chair, despite the fact I had 5 children at the time. And because actually somebody has got to go out there. But the downside of that is that it is a little bit like repeatedly hitting your head against a brick wall. And there is only so much of that you are going to take before you go, enough, I am out. This is not worth me jeopardizing my psychological safety for. And what prides need to look at is there's a problem. If you look at on boards of prides, okay, I can only really speak for the UK, but probably across the world, how diverse are your boards? Who are the people that are making the decisions? When I came on board as chair, I was a community officer for a couple of years prior to that, but I brought in an accessibility officer role so that we could begin to expand who is safe at Pride. Because actually, there's a whole group of people who are extremely safe at Pride, and they have become complacent in that safety. UK Black Pride would not need to exist if racism wasn't experienced at Prides. And so admitting there is an issue, having these difficult conversations, accessing resources, also matching it to the topography of where you are, looking at things like code switching, which is psychologically damaging. Code switching is where we play up and play down facets of our personality or identity because we don't feel safe in that space. You'll go into a space, you'll risk assess, you'll code switch. You keep doing that, you can lose sight of who you are, authentically you. So that kind of shows up in my private practice and in my training work of like, who are you really? Because you've had to keep swapping and changing as to where you are. Ask the experience. Don't challenge the experience. When I wrote my piece, I quite expected to be challenged on it. I actually got a tremendous amount of support from lots of people who were like, yeah, I felt like that. Or I'm a more mature person and I felt like that. I'm HIV positive and I felt like that. But all of these people have felt that they could not speak out, that they would be othered, they would be silenced, and their experience would be challenged. So ask the experience, take good statistics, proper statistics, don't just have BAME on a form and think you can get away with it. And don't challenge somebody else's experience. Become comfortable in the uncomfortable. This stuff is challenging, this stuff is hard, and people out there might not necessarily want to hear it, but there will be no change unless there is that challenge.
There was something that both Julian and Zaina mentioned that I want to piggyback on, and let me start there because I don't want to forget it. What Zaina said about code switching, my God, the psychological, tennis match you're dealing with when you're exposing that. And that's been happening for me for so long. At 12, I went from an inner city school to an all-white school. That's where it started. And that has continued my entire life. Even now, my husband, who's white, mentioned to me, like, you talk differently when you're around your family. And I had to explain code switching to him. So, well, I don't understand. Like, I know you don't. We'll revisit this. But, it's mentally exhausting to the point where I am now as a 50-year-old man. I am no longer afraid to be an angry Black man. You're going to get an angry Black man from time to time because I have a lot that has pissed me off in the 50 years that I've been on this planet. And now I'm not going to push that down all the time because I know it's not healthy. It's not healthy. And what Julian mentioned about the implicit, the IAT test, I remember I gave a workshop on implicit bias to a company in Switzerland. And before I gave the workshop, I wanted everyone to take the test, which I think every board member of every Pride board should take this test. I've taken it several times. I've only been surprised once, and I'm not even going to get into that. But when we had the workshop and we're talking about microaggressions and implicit bias and so forth, there was an Asian woman, Asian American, who's working in Denmark, working in Switzerland, married to a white Swiss. And she was talking about what she's dealing with her own husband. And what came to mind is what Zaina talked about before too, is that you can be in a relationship with a person of color and still be racially insensitive, still be racially biased. The poor woman was in tears. I'm thinking, if my husband ever, this marriage would be over that quickly. But she's fighting for her marriage. She's fighting for her recognition at work. And the friend of mine who arranged this, white man, was shocked. He said, I speak to her every day. I had no idea what she was dealing with. And that is the problem. We don't know what people are dealing with. So I often tell people, if you don't know my journey, don't tell me how to navigate it. Don't tell me what racism is if that's not something you experience, especially from the perspective of a Black man. Do not tell me what it is and what it isn't. Don't tell me how I should feel. Don't tell me how I should act. To me, that's like when people used to go to Oprah Winfrey and talk about marriage. She's never been married. They go to Oprah Winfrey to get her advice on children. She doesn't have any children. That is how I feel when people who don't know my experience come and tell me how I should handle it. So as Pride organizers, number one, do not dismiss anyone's feelings, because unless you've gone through it, you have no way of knowing how deep it cuts, how mentally challenging it is to deal with this on a consistent basis. You have no idea. So educate yourself by, one, closing your mouth and listening to what people are saying.
Julian, back to you about the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program of InterPride. Sure. Listening to our friend Zaina and Richard, we understand that Pride organizers can take some concrete measures and steps to ensure that that the space is more accessible and more and more inviting. For example, we spoke about having a diverse board, about who's a decision maker, about who is safe at Pride, who really feel safe at Pride. We also spoke about never dismissing people's experiences, never challenging somebody's experience. And then we spoke about code switching, and that was quite loud in my head, because how many, for example, how many gay guys thicken their voices, their voice for them to fit in a specific circle of people, and how many girls try to act more girly, whatever that means, also to fit somewhere, and how many trans and non-binary people adapt the way they introduce themselves depending on the people they hang out with. And this is very surprising because all of us, people of the sexual and gender diversity, we do some code switching. And obviously, it seems that when we are a person of color, we have another set of code switching to do. And when we are non-binary, we have another code switching to do. So it's quite profound to have this conversation and to really take ownership of what's being discussed and draw parallelism, you know, create this bridge between what we hear from you and what we go through, because it resonates quite loudly. What's your take on this, Julian?
Yeah, I wanted to say that the more layers someone identifies with, the more you code switch, because, you know, for example, if you are an immigrant, if you're a person of color, if you're a trans person, you know, that's already so many challenges, and then you've got to navigate so many different spaces. And so you know, obviously code switch as well as given those circumstances. But I think I also wanted to highlight what's important is the mental health consequences of all of this. You know, if you do a lot more literature review, you know, recent studies have started showing the amount of mental health consequences, especially people of color, have to go through, given the different circumstances that we experience in different spaces, with microaggressions and biases and just outright racism sometimes. And so, and that obviously translates within, for Pride organizers within the spaces that we are in as well, quite regularly. I think Zaina's example is quite a great one, really. I think the amount of, I'm sorry for using this word, and I'm using this intentionally, the trauma that she may have had to experience in that space over time is, you know, the mental health consequences of it. Sometimes people don't realize. And I think that mental, you know, when you are experiencing that, it, you know, there are things that you do and the things that you act of because of those situations people don't understand, and they they cannot, if they've not experienced it, they don't even understand where that's coming from and why someone is acting in a certain way. And so I want to talk a little bit more about InterPride specifically as an example. And we're not perfect. We have a lot of growth to do, but we are working very hard in trying to address those issues. And we've recognized for a fact that, you know, within InterPride, different spaces that we've been, you know, folks have experienced racism. And sometimes it's been to degrees that's really unacceptable in this space. And I think we have been more intentional in the last year and a half in trying to address these issues. We've been more intentional in ensuring that there's more representation, not just, you know, in terms of people of color, but also, you know, geographic region, you know, social backgrounds, and, you know, all of that too. So we've been a lot more intentional in trying to get people to come onto the board representing different walks of life. So I think that's important. We have had more active conversations within our board. You know, we have removed people within our board who we know that, you know, have either displayed microaggressions or implicit biases, and, you know, and are not willing to talk about it or accept it. You know, we are having discussions about doing trainings on implicit biases, on microaggressions, and we're bringing in consultants right now to help facilitate those trainings for our leadership team, not just the board, but the co-chairs and our regional representatives just all across. And, you know, we are going to be phasing those trainings out, so they're not just happening once. So, you know, that's the impact of it's a lot more significant. So these are some things that we are already consciously wanting to do. And, you know, I appreciate that the board is more open to doing this. And we've encouraged our board members to go and read about stuff, you know, talk to us. And we have a lot of this interesting discussions about racism. And I've noticed some of our board members who are not necessarily very aware of this are becoming more aware. They're trying to understand this, and that's important, and that's great. Like I said, we've got a lot of progress to still make, and I think these are great small steps, baby steps that we're taking along the way to get to a better place. and I appreciate the board for that. And I think that's also why we launched the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program, because we recognize that, you know, as an umbrella organization representing all of its members, there's a lot of work to do across the globe. And I know racism, sometimes, you know, when you talk about India, our members in India, they could experience it a little differently. You know, colorism is a huge thing there, and, you know, and how do you talk about issues like that, right? And then when you talk about our members in Europe, there's a lot of experiences around immigrants and the experiences of immigrants and the discrimination that they face in addition to being immigrants, the xenophobia and also the racism that comes with being immigrants, etc. How can Pride organizers navigate those kind of issues? And then talking about First Nation individuals, you know, how can we be more inclusive of First Nation communities? You know, we have a lot of First Nation prides across the globe. We have leaders in the space who want to make sure that they are heard. How can we provide more space for them? Especially when you talk about World Pride, it's supposed to be a more inclusive environment. What are we doing? What can we do better? You know, when you talk about some of the violence that folks are facing, you know, especially our Asian, here in the United States, our Asian American communities and the African American communities, the experiences that they've had. How can we talk about this and provide a space as Pride organizers? Because as Pride organizers, it's not just about throwing a Pride festival or Pride march. There's a lot more that we can do. And we can do that programming all year round. And it can look, you know, so it can take multiple forms. It's not just about the board, it's also about the talent that we bring in. Do they represent a variety of the audience that we're catering to? You know, our programming, obviously, there's so many different things. And of course, what's one of the most important discussions that's happening right now is police presence in Pride spaces, right? In some countries, they may argue that it's really important, but that's not always the case in other countries. So how do you navigate this? You know, I know, for example, New York City Pride recently, we made an active decision not to have police officers in the space, especially the Pride March. We also made an active decision to make sure that the Gay Officers Action League can participate in the march, but they cannot have their uniforms on, and they cannot have their weapons on. And so they didn't necessarily agree there. So, you know, these are discussions that we can have as Pride organizers. So that's kind of why we came up with the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program, because we want to have these important discussions. And, you know, we thought, okay, if we were to organize webinars, we were to put in, you know, a resources page where people can refer, that'd be a great way for Pride organizers across the world to actually start. Richard is one of them on the team, and I know we recently just started partnering with Human Rights Campaign here in the United States, and they are actually giving us a grant to do a lot more work, and we're going to be officially launching that partnership this week. So we're really excited about the potential of this. There's still a lot of work to do, but, you know, I really would suggest and invite all of our, you know, Pride organizers across the globe to come check out the program that we're going to be working on. We're working on other partnerships with different parts of the world. We're actually launching a diversity awareness festival in the next few months that will also be part of the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program. So there's a lot of things that we're working on. So very excited about that. So do check out, we have a website, a page on our website as well that actually talks a little bit about what we do. So yeah, I hope that was actually, I'm happy to answer more questions that if you have. Feel free to ask me anything.
Feisty and bubbly, we love it. It's just great to see how things are moving forward and how also the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program serves as a library of resources that enable Pride organizations and organizers better serve the inclusion of people based on race, color, ethnicity, and so on. So we evolve in spaces where microaggressions are we're conscious of our microaggressions, of our bias, and so on, and you have the possibility of engaging in an honest and courageous conversation to better frame this. For us not to run out of time and to honor our 45-minute mark, I would like to end on this question. I'd like to ask you about how important World Pride is to create a long-lasting impact for this intersection between race and pride.
Go on then. Yeah. And we just look and go,
Yeah, I think I spoke quite a bit there earlier.
you know, it's so important that we do decenter whiteness as the default in pride spaces. And, you know, and doing that not only like last time we had a parade in Oxford, my daughter marched. And, you know, for me as a parent to be able to see my children engaging in, okay, this is, you know, this is mum's thing, but something that also has an effect on their life is just fantastic. You know, pride should be about the ability to be yourself, to be truly authentic, have it accepted and not challenged. It should be about respect, listening, because we really can be stronger together, and no one should have to apologize or minimize themselves for trying to include other people that are marginalized. And that goes for neurodivergency, that goes for accessibility, that goes for age, and it, you know, it goes for socioeconomic class. This is a massive thing to do, but we can most definitely do it when we do it together.
I think for me, I guess the focus is often what pride should be, what it should mean to me. I came out later in life in my 30s. First Pride parade, I put on my short shorts and my tank top and didn't pay any attention to how I walked or my mannerisms. I was perfectly fine being an effeminate man out there and having a great time. I understand what pride, how pride started and what it was originally meant to be. And I don't want to get away from that. I mean, I think it's important to continue to fight for equality and recognition and authenticity. I think those things are still extremely important. I don't think because in many of our countries we got marriage equality that the fight is over. It clearly is not. There was a very famous rapper recently who's facing blowback the baby for a lot of the homophobic things he said, which we all know hip hop culture has been steeped in homophobia for so long. And then to see someone someone like Lil Nas X, you know, just really show his sexuality, his identity. And I know I've been hearing from my family the things they used to say about other gay people in our neighborhood. Well, they're just throwing it in our faces. You know how much it's been thrown in our faces for so long? It's nice that somebody is throwing something back at you. So accept it. I think that's what pride means to me as well, that we're all accepted, whether we are the most effeminate or the most masculine or butch or whatever labels you want to add on it. This should be a place that we go that is our haven, our safe space where we can completely be ourselves until the world catches up to where we are. And then for me, it's really important to look back with our younger generation and see what pride means to them. I think there's been a disconnect over the years. They're not so connected to Stonewall. You know, they don't care as much about a gay club. That doesn't mean as much to them as it meant to my generation and those before me. So we got to figure out where they are, what's missing for them, what they need from us, because they need to be included in this as well.
Hari, so I think that having conversations like this is so important, and allowing for an opportunity for this kind of conversations, especially during World Pride, is so important. So I'm glad that we're actually doing this, and we need to probably do this on a larger, wider scale, a lot more. And I think what better space than World Pride, really, right, to actually be able to do this. I think people shy away from having these discussions because they think it's going to be a difficult conversation to have. They think that, well, it doesn't really affect me, you know, I'm not this, and so they just don't want to have those conversations. But I think having these conversations are important to educate and understand this better because we all can do a lot more. And I think, you know, it's important to also keep in mind that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So, you know, it doesn't mean that just because we are doing some great work in some part of the world, you know, we can just ignore the rest of the world, what's happening with other Pride organizations. And I think that's a huge role. And as someone on the leadership team of InterPride, that's something that I really want to advocate for. And that's why I think this is so important for World Pride to be able to do this, right? And we have these conversations, it creates more awareness. And I think in the future World Prides that we're going to be organizing, we should actually have maybe a number of different sessions, and we could include other communities like First Nation communities. They're so, you know, marginalized and so often not brought to the forefront in having this kind of discussions. So I think it's so important, and this Pride can actually do that. You know, we can actually provide that opportunity, and that's why it's so important. Something that Richard said, you know, there's a disconnect with the different generations, and I think these are what people are expecting more. You know, we're not just about throwing parties, and we're just not about you know, festivals and parades. Yes, you can choose to celebrate Pride in any way in any way you want to. Everyone has a right to, but it's important to understand that because of all of these different needs, Pride organizers need to keep up with this change and make sure that we're catering to all of the different audience. And so having discussions like this, being able to protest, being able to talk about difficult you know, issues and bring those to the forefront is also important, in addition to celebrating your identity and who you are. So I think that's just kind of my quick spiel to kind of end this.
And you know, we really often speak about what Pride is, but also it's important to think about the function of Pride and what it causes, what it produces, and how people relate to it. Zaina Rati, Richard Brotourbel, Julian Sanjivan, it was an honor and a privilege to have you with us. This was the Pride and Race webinar brought to you by InterPride. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.